everyone, welcome back to my channel. It's time for the October 2022 wrap-up. October ended up being a way better reading month for me than September. I know if you saw my last video, September, I think I only had 4 books. So it actually turns out that I'd read 5, but I completely forgot about one of them. So I'm going to cover that one in this month's episode. So let's get right into it. The first book that I read was actually my September book. We're starting out hot. I read The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and I have some opinions on this. I know that this is a pretty beloved book across BookTube and the greater reading community. I didn't like it. I am going to go onto my Goodreads, though, and share a few of my thoughts about why I didn't really enjoy this book the way everybody else seemed to. So on Goodreads, I actually gave this book only 1 star. Now, that's not to say that I felt like the writing was so bad that it was only a 1-star quality book. My issues with it were multiple things that, to me, compounded into giving it a 1-star rating. I didn't hate this book per se. I just felt that it was poorly done. To me, the writing was kind of heavy-handed, and I really, really disliked the big plot twist. I felt that it was completely unnecessary, and it created characters in the book whose sole purpose was to facilitate the plot twist. If that is the sole purpose that a character or multiple characters are in a book, I don't think that that is worth having a plot twist then. These characters were underdeveloped, they were underexplored, and they were really treated as throwaway characters in more than one way, which really bothered me. The main character of the book, aside from Evelyn, had absolutely no characteristics. Her entire character was, she's a biracial woman who is unsure of herself, unsure of her standing in her chosen field, which is journalism, with an unsure status of her marriage. I don't mind the character being introduced that way originally, but I felt like there was absolutely no character development and no character growth throughout the book. And then when you get towards the end with the plot twist, without spoiling anything, the twist wasn't even a twist really. It didn't shake your perception of the book or the characters or the narrative. It was just, boom, surprised about this totally unbelievable connection. I personally felt the use of this specific plot twist was disrespectful and hurtful to the communities that those characters are a part of, and it felt totally inappropriate because of how unnecessary it was. There was no commentary, no learning from it, no deeper point. It was just throwaway characters by another character with a position of privilege that would wreak havoc on those of less privilege for absolutely no purpose. And I think, to me, that's the problem. It's not so much the actual events that happened in the book and in the story. It's that they served no purpose other than for, ooh, I made such a crazy plot twist. And that really bothers me. That really bothers me because of the types of characters that the author chose to use for this plot twist and for this narrative. And because of that, I really can't rate it any higher. I felt like the blurb on the back of the book was also incredibly deceptive about the actual story. It sold itself as a completely different tale, and I would rather have had the blurb on the back and all of these synopses be a little bit more vague about what the story actually is about, because it's very deceptive about what the story really is. And I feel, again, that that's completely unnecessary. If I'm choosing books based on their synopsis, then I want an authentic or honest synopsis. And if you want to leave it intentionally vague to pique my interest, then so be it. I just felt like everything about this book had some ulterior motive. And as a reader and as a consumer of this book, it didn't sit right with me. None of the elements and how the white author handled it sat well with me. So I gave it a 1-star rating. I I know that so many people on BookTube are going to disagree. I know that this is a hugely highly rated book. I know that people absolutely love it. And if you love it, I don't have any problem with that. I don't think that you enjoying this book has anything to say necessarily about you and about your values or anything like that. I personally just didn't care for it. It didn't click with me. And I think that these elements were a big reason why it didn't click with me. And if it clicked with you and if you loved it, that's totally fine. So I would be interested, though, to know in the comments below if you've read this book, which I feel like a lot of people on BookTube have. Let me know how you felt about it. Let me know what rating you would have given it. But I would also like to know how you felt about the plot twist and the characters that were used and the way that those characters were used in the plot twist, because I'm very curious to see if other people had similar feelings, or even after my explanation, if you completely disagree, tell me down in the comments below. I'm very interested to know what other people thought of this book, to actually have a conversation about it. So that was my first read of September, The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Okay, the next book that I read is the only one that I have a physical copy of. Everything else is going to have to be pictures, because I listened to all of these on audiobook. Every single one of the books that I read in October was an audiobook through Libby. However, I have a physical copy of this one because I loved it so much. I actually bought it the next time I was at the bookstore, and that is Circe by Madeline Miller. This book to me was a 5-star read. Absolutely loved this book. I loved the voice that it took, and the fact that it took a pretty well-known piece of a very well-known Greek myth, and it expanded upon it, and it gave so much more life to the character that this myth talks about very briefly. We all know about Odysseus. So many of the Greek myths and the heroes of those Greek myths are men. They focus on the tale of the men, and a lot of times the women in those myths, who even had huge roles, are sadly left unfleshed out, kind of throwaway, even though they may have had very, very, very important roles. They're not talked about more. They're not expanded on more. They don't have a wide mythos behind them, unless they are maybe one of the prime deities of Greek mythology: Athena, Artemis, Aphrodite. So I was really happy to have this little side character completely given her own life, her own world. And I thought Madeline Miller did such an amazing job fleshing out her character, coming up with her motivations from being a young child, the daughter of Helios and the daughter of a water nymph. And part of why I loved this book so much was how much water language there was throughout the book. It was this thread that wove everything together. And if you've seen my reading vlogs, you know I am a water baby. I have been around water all of my life. My family has been around water. I live in a state with a ton of lakes. I was a competitive swimmer in high school, though you wouldn't know to look at me. I'm obsessed with the water. I absolutely feel at home there. And so the language in Circe that talks about water and its her connection to it, her elemental affinity for it, and how it felt like home, it felt like an embrace, it felt familiar and safe. Being the daughter of a water nymph, it was absolutely beautiful. The story that this told about this character and how she becomes banished, that is the word, how she became banished to an island and then became the witch of the island because she didn't have the powers that her parents had as divine beings, but she basically forged her own, categorized her in a completely different way than the other Greek deities. I absolutely loved it, and I loved her enjoying her solitude. This banishment ended up being a great thing for her because she did what she wanted. She was able to live a life very, very much how she wanted to live it. Every single page of this was so beautiful. It was never over the top. in how lyrical it was or how the symbolism was used, the metaphors and the similes. It was all incredibly, incredibly beautiful, but never to the point where you're just like, okay, can you just get on with the story and, calm down on all the prose? Never felt that way. As soon as I was finished with this, I was hunting for something similar. I wanted another Circe story so badly. So that's why I had to go pick up a physical copy of it when I was at the bookstore. And just look at this. I mean, the foil on this, it's gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous. And new book smell. Oh, I love new book smell. So this is the only book that I have a physical copy of, but I did listen to it on audiobook. And the audio narration of this, again, 5-star, absolutely stunning. The narrator who did this book was just amazing. Perfection. So if I had one book to recommend of all the books that I read in October, it's going to be Circe by Madeline Miller. Go check it out. Okay, so the next book that I read, I actually read this side by side a little bit with Circe. This was The Lamplighters by Emma Stonex. I ended up giving this one 3 stars. This is the based on a true event or inspired by a real event where there was a lighthouse that was not on the shoreline. It was actually on a rock out in the sea where there's nothing around it. And there were 3 lighthouse keepers, lamplighters, who disappeared one day without a trace. And the mystery of what happened to them and how that happened to them was apparently very big at the time. It happened in 1972. And so that mysterious event inspired this fictional tale of what may have occurred. I was really excited to read this at the same time as Circe because of the water language. And it's the water language from a completely different perspective. Circe was born of the ocean, and so it was her home. It was something she never had to be afraid of. But the Lamplighters speak of the ocean, each in their own way, but all very much afraid of it, respectful of it, even loving it, but knowing you don't turn your back on the ocean. You never know what's going to happen. This Maiden's Rock, where the lighthouse was, is an incredibly dangerous place to land a boat, embark or disembark from it, even just walking around it, because the way the waves crash up. It can be a perfectly calm day, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere you're going to get a huge wave and it'll just sweep you away. So I enjoyed the water language in this book as well. I appreciate the respect for the ocean, the respectful fear that people have to have of it. But the prose definitely did not match anything close to Circe or close to Madeline Miller. I really loved the premise of the story. I loved the idea of it, and I even really enjoyed the way that it was told by flashing between different perspectives. And just as you were about to learn something that felt very important, it would flash to the next person's story. And rather than being frustrating for me, I actually enjoyed that because every single person had an interesting piece of the puzzle to talk about and to start to describe. So as the picture became clearer and clearer, you still didn't have firm edges, because just as you were about to get that little piece, it would flash to somebody else's story. I thought it was well done how the author timed changing the perspective. What I didn't care for was I felt like the actual explanation of not necessarily what happened, but why it happened, to me came out of left field. There was a couple of elements thrown in here and there that you kind of picked up on, and you're like, did I suddenly start reading a different book? Because this feels totally unrelated. This feels totally out of left field for what this book has already built itself up to be. And that was my problem with it. And I read some other reviews on Goodreads, and the people who had similar ratings to mine, which is, like I said, a 3, maybe 3.5 star. No, 3 star. Had similar criticisms. Those elements felt thrown in for no reason. I feel like the motivations behind what happened could have been better explained, more elegantly explained. The motivations could have stayed very, very similar, but given a more realistic footing. So by the time you got to the end and you find out what happened, it was unsatisfying. Not because it wasn't plausible or not because it wasn't a good reveal, but the elements that kind of led up to it just didn't feel like they fit. It felt like they were just, the author was struggling to figure out how to make it all come together and threw in a couple elements to just make it work for the sake of making it work. So that was The Lamplighters by Emma Stonex, 3 stars. Okay, so then I read a book by accident. I got a deal off of Chirp, which said, hey, this author and this book is like, I don't know, it's like $2 or $3 or something. And I was like, oh, Gabriela Garcia Marquez. Absolutely want to read that. So I grabbed the deal. This was months ago. So I get around to actually starting to play it. And after maybe a chapter, I was like, I've never read Gabriela Garcia Marquez. I absolutely want to. The book on my shelf that I have waiting for that is 100 Years of Solitude. Cannot wait to read it. Something about this book, I was like, I feel like this is not right somehow. And I looked it up. So, Of Women in Salt is by Gabriela Garcia, not Gabrielle Garcia Marquez. So, I bought the book thinking it was a completely different author, and then I read it, and it's 4.5 stars. I absolutely loved this book. My criticism of it is probably my own fault. It is, again, a multi-viewpoint story, so it's told by different people at different times in history, and most of it follows the same family from Cuba, and it follows the women of this family from modern day Jeanette, her mother, her grandmother, and then I want to say it's like great or great, so it like skips a generation or two between the grandmother and the original point of view from the story that kind of sets everything in motion. And this is a family who survived the revolution in Cuba, and some of them emigrated to the United States, where the current generation, Jeanette, was born in the United States. She is an American citizen by birth. But she feels this strong tie and this pull back to Cuba because she wants to know about her family, she wants to know about her heritage, and her mother will not talk about it. Her mother will say nothing about her own mother back in Cuba, and she won't say why she won't say anything. So Jeanette struggles with addiction. She is addicted to alcohol, she's addicted to opioids, she has done a number of drugs in her time, but her biggest current addiction, I can't remember if she ends up on heroin or if it was purely the opioid addiction. The struggle that I had off the bat was with, I think because it was an audiobook, it was a singular narrator who did an absolutely stellar job. Fantastic. Each of the characters in dialogue and just the feel of it, it sounded so beautiful to listen to. However, that was also my struggle, is at the beginning of the chapter, it would give you who is speaking and in what year. And sometimes, especially as I was listening to this at work, I would get distracted and I would not be able to hear this is Jeanette in present day, or this is Jeanette 10 years ago, or this is Dolores, 50 years ago. It was hard to follow sometimes who the story was about. It got better as it went on. I got better at understanding who was actually talking, but I did struggle with that a little bit, and I feel like I lost some of the flow and I lost some of the information because I was still stuck on the previous person's perspective and not who it's actually currently talking about or their perspective. That being said, this book was amazing. Absolutely cried. Oh, I ran the gamut of emotions with this. Of Women in Salt talks about the story of women and their salt, what makes them. And the salt is typically either their sweat of their brow or their tears. This talks about racism for Afro-Cubans. This talks about immigration, this talks about deportation, this talks about trauma, this talks about violence against women, this talks about addiction, this talks about spousal abuse and revolution and mothers and daughters and granddaughters and the trauma that they try to protect each other from through silence, but what that silence does to the next generation. when they don't understand why. Why won't you talk about something? Why are you hiding something? Mothers and daughters perpetuating trauma while trying to protect their daughters from trauma. It was so good. It was so good. I really, if you can't pick up Circe, pick up Of Women in Salt by Gabriela Garcia. I thought that this was absolutely beautiful because when it talked about each woman and what she did to survive, it never did it with any judgment or commentary on whether what she did was right or wrong. It simply gave you the situation. This is what's happening. This is what this person is going through and enduring. And this is how they're surviving it, or they did survive it. And if you want to make a morality call about it, that's on you. The author was not going to do that work for you. And I thought that was so expertly done. And I think, trying to look, I think this was her debut novel, if I'm not mistaken, because I listened to the author's note at the end. It was actually a conversation between her and I want to say one of her professors, because part of this story was her thesis for her master or something. It was just, oh my gosh, it was really incredible. I absolutely loved it and I highly recommend it. However, this does come with, like I said, a ton of trigger warnings, so please check into that before you decide to read this for yourself. I know personally I can handle this kind of content. I can handle a lot of content that might be very upsetting and very triggering to others, but I know off the top of my head, like somebody close to me would not be able to read this. I absolutely know that. Even describing the book to them was incredibly emotionally impactful. And so just be aware of that and take care of yourself. I definitely think it's a book worth reading, but just check into it first and make sure that you're in a headspace where you feel safe doing so. What did I read next? I read Malice by Keigo Higashino, who also wrote The Devotion of Suspect X, Salvation of a Saint. Keigo Higashino keeps knocking it out of the park for me. Emotionally, I'm going to say Devotion of Suspect X, I think I connected with a little bit more, but Malice was also a 4-star read for me, maybe 4.5. Just so expert, because the other novels by Keigo Higashino that I've read, you already know who the murderer is. It happens like on the first couple of pages, and then it's the cops trying to figure it out, prove it, and catch the person. In Malice, they catch, you don't know exactly what happened at first, but pretty quickly into the book, they catch the person. They do not want to let the case go, though, until they figure out and prove why. Because if they can't prove motive, they're worried that their case won't stick. And then the novel really, really begins from there, because he is just poking hole in his story, hole after hole after hole, because he's like, no, I don't believe that's why you did it. I know you did it. You know you did it. You've confessed. I need to know why. And the person will not give the reason why. And so the rest of the novel is determining what malice could this person have had to cause him to murder somebody. I thought I had this one. I really, really did. I thought for sure I knew what was going on. I thought for sure I was catching the undercurrent, like, oh, all the other readers are up here at the surface level. I'm seeing this undercurrent. I'm seeing these other threads carrying me away. No, that was a plant by the author to make you think you knew what was going on when you didn't. Oh my gosh, so good. I mean, if you're talking about a really good mystery, Malice by Keigo Higashino, go read it. I can't believe how much I read in October. I'm so happy by how much I got to read. So the next book was The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. I found this as I was looking for something like Circe. So the story of The Silence of the Girls is from the point of Briseis, who was the queen of a captured city that Achilles had sacked. And as such, she was given to Achilles as his prize. Again, this is the perspective of female characters in the midst of Greek myths dominated by the men. So there are so many stories about Achilles. There are so many stories about Odysseus. There's so many stories about Agamemnon, the fall of Troy, and King Priam and Paris, and that's all you really get as far as meat of characters. I don't think that sounds right, but you know what? I'm just going to ignore it. The Silence of the Girls instead focuses on Briseis and how she survives, being now she is the prize of Achilles, and as such she is his slave. Any woman who is captured as part of war becomes essentially a slave. I mean, that's pretty typical throughout history. It wasn't quite as poetic and lyrical as Circe, but the story felt so similar and tied to it. I gave this 4 stars. Absolutely loved it. The narrator, again, 5-star narration, knocked it out of the park. And I am going to read a little bit of my Goodreads review of this. I don't write huge Goodreads reviews, but I've been trying to write a little bit more, especially so I can help remember what my biggest points were about the books. So, the story of the greatest war in history, the greatest warriors the world has ever known. But what if they weren't legends? What if they were simply men? Men good at fighting and conquering. Men who took what they wanted, what they earned from sacking a city. Even men born of gods, the mundane ordinariness of them, of their temper tantrums and their swelled ego and their insatiable pride. What about the stories of everyone else? The women captured from those sacked cities, the slaves they all became for their captors. What are their stories? How does history look through the eyes of those not blinded by the gleaming of these legends? And that's really what it was. The perspective of Briseis saw Achilles not as great Achilles, valiant Achilles, shining Achilles, immortal Achilles, impervious Achilles. He was simply a man, incredibly good at warfare, so much blood on his hands. He bathed in blood every time he fought. He was a petulant child at times. It was so refreshing to see the story from somebody else's perspective that wasn't just fawning over these Greek heroes. And it wasn't just that it was the perspective of a Trojan, but that it was the perspective of a woman who didn't see the world in these rose-colored glasses. War and the horrors of war and what happened to the women and the children and the men and the young boys as a result of it. Quite brutal. It does talk about the violence of war at times. It does have sexual assault. So there's definitely some trigger warnings to look up, but I thought it was so beautifully done. And the commentary on it, while slightly heavy-handed at times, slightly repetitive at times, I felt was being done for such an intentional purpose that those slight things that kind of just felt a little clunky so easily overlooked for me. So The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. Now, when I look it up on Goodreads, it says The Women of Troy Part or Number 1. So I don't know if this is part of a series. But if it is, I want to read more because I thought Pat Barker was an absolutely phenomenal writer. When I did look up more from Pat Barker, it seemed like a lot of historical fiction, and there was a series of, I think, 3 books, but they take place in World War One, World War II, World War One. I can't remember. Those didn't interest me quite so much. So I'm going to check and see, though, if The Women of Troy or Women of Troy is one of a series, because if so, I will definitely be checking out more from that series. Okay, 2 more to go. Man, this video is going to be long. I also read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie. This I read in a couple of days, audiobook. While my mom and I did a fall color tour, we were both just needing some nature, needing a quiet day, needing a road trip, needing color and vivacity. And so we drove across the state and just drove and drove and drove all day long and listened to The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie. And I gave this 4 stars. This was a really good reading month for me. I actually had this book spoiled for me before I read it, but I didn't want to tell my mom that. So as she was trying to figure out the mystery, I kept my mouth shut about who I obviously knew was the perpetrator. Even so, though, I will say it was really interesting going into the story knowing who done it, because I thought it was going to be very easy for me to pick up on the clues that then point to him. Agatha Christie does such a good job that as the mystery is being investigated by Hercule Poirot, it is not glaringly obvious who it is if you already know who it is, but it also makes sense within the context. So even though it's not easy to say, oh, there's the key piece of evidence or there's another piece of evidence that totally points to this person, it's not done in a way where you get to the end, you're like, I feel cheated because it doesn't make any sense. I don't think that there was, evidence that was found was never really talked about or given to the reader. So there's no way that the reader could have figured it out. It was all very subtly done so that even being spoiled from it, I still felt it was a satisfying mystery. And I feel like that's an incredible thing to say for this book, because I think going into a mystery, having it spoiled, if it can still be mysterious, you got a good mystery book on your hands there. So The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie, highly recommend. I know some people get frustrated by kind of the reveal and the big shocking, it's penned as Agatha Christie's most shocking novel. I would say, I wouldn't necessarily say it's shocking. I just think it's a very well done mystery. I think it's a very well written story. And the characters, I think, are all very intriguing because everybody has something that they're hiding. And I think that really is partly why it's so successful, because that not everybody could have done it. That not everybody's going to have a motive to do it necessarily, but that everybody was hiding something, and intentionally hiding something really did give a very authentic feel to the story. And then my final book was We Are Not Free by Tracy Chee. I said this in my vlog when I finished it. I don't know what to say about this book. I'm going to have to collect my thoughts for my wrap up. I don't know what to say about this book still. It is really hard to put into words without just reading it for yourself. So the basic premise is it follows, I think it ends up being like 14 people, all teenagers who are Japanese American. They're all natural born American citizens in San Francisco and Japantown when Pearl Harbor happens. And they all know that their lives are about to drastically change because there's already rumors on the wind about the relocation camps, the Japanese internment camps. They're prison camps, they're concentration camps. That's what it is. It doesn't matter what the government wanted to call them. So it follows each of these kids. All of them they grew up in the same neighborhood, they know each other, they're friends, and it follows each of their stories from before the attack happens, as the order comes through, the evacuation order, aka we're putting you into a prison camp, and then their life in the prison camp until the camps are disbanded. I don't know how you can write so many different characters, and the entirety of the novel, the heartbeat of this novel is every single one of them, and how you can write them so incredibly well. Each person was such an individual. Siblings were still very different from each other, but they were also shown through the same lens of a shared family experience because they both shared the same parents. They grew up in the same way. Every single character was so well fleshed out, so well developed. And I rarely ever got confused about who was talking in the story because it's first person perspective and it just keeps flipping. I do think, now this is going to be interesting because of Women in Salt, I struggled a little because of the multi-perspective because it was an audiobook. In this one, I think it was so much easier to follow because it was an audiobook. And the difference was there were multiple voice actors for We Are Not Free. There were a number of male actors, a number of female actors, narrators, and because the voice changes were not just the same person trying to sound different, but were actually different people, it was incredibly easy to know when you have stepped out of one person's perspective into the next. Every single one of these narrators did an amazing job. This is a 5-star read for me. I ended up in tears at the end of almost every single chapter of this book. It was infuriating. It was heartbreaking. It was terrifying. It was heartwarming and joyful at times. The relationships of these kids where they stick together so fiercely. It doesn't matter that their parents have differing views about now the American government versus the Japanese government. It doesn't matter that the American government sees them as hostiles. It doesn't matter that Japan has abandoned them. It doesn't matter that they're in a prison camp. These kids love each other and will defend each other and support each other. The friendship between male characters that was not burdened by toxic masculinity, the caring that the male characters had for the female characters, their friends without wanting more, expecting more. It was just kids sticking together, true friendship, and it was beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful. And other than that, I don't know what to say about it. It made me feel incredible emotions, just literally a roller coaster, up and down, loop, threw me for a loop, and then it shot me back up, and then it dragged me back down. I would also say very much so, listen to the author's note at the end. It adds even so much more power to the story because this is a fictional tale about absolutely real events. The things that happen in this book are not fiction. The characters may be amalgamations of multiple people's stories, multiple people's experiences. They very, very easily could have been plucked from history, each and every single one of them, as a unique individual. And for that reason, it is heartbreaking in a way that genuine fiction and fantasy can never be, because people lived this, people survived this, people died like this, and it is incredibly powerful. I do have two quotes that I want to read from this. I saved them when I was listening to it. I bookmarked it because I had to go back and listen to it multiple times. So the first quote is, "No amount of wanting will return the moments you have lost and the people you have loved. But you have not lost so many pieces of yourself that you do not want to give away one more." And then the other one was from a young boy. The line that got me was, "What is the sound of one boy drowning in his mother's dreams?" He knew he was never going to be good enough for his parents, and his parents just dreamed of a perfect child that he couldn't be, and instead of seeing him, he was just drowning in the dreams that his parents kept trying to throw onto him. It hurt. It hurt so bad. Every single chapter punches you, but it is so valuable. It is so worth reading these stories, and to read the perspective of Nisei, the second generation of those from Japan into America, was just incredible. Absolutely incredible. 5 stars. Read it. That's all I can say. I absolutely loved it. So yeah, please read Circe, read Silence of the Girls, read Malice, and read We Are Not Free. And if you have to only pick between them, Circe and We Are Not Free. Those are my top choices for October. Absolutely wonderful reading month. I am currently reading 2 more audiobooks. I thought maybe I could finish them today. It is October 31st, and I don't think I'm going to get through them. So I figured it was probably safe to go ahead and film my wrap up for October. So thank you so much for joining me. And please let me know down in the comments below, what did you read in October? Have you read any of the books that I've read? And if you have not, which one interests you the most? And if you have opinions on my opinions of Evelyn Hugo, please leave them down in the comments below. I really am interested to hear other people's viewpoints and have differing opinions from my own. I just do ask that if you are going to disagree with myself, if you're going to disagree with others in the comments, please remember to be kind and to be civil. It is absolutely possible to have differing opinions and still be friends and be friendly and be kind and be civil while having a discussion. So that is all I ask. But please do not avoid conversation just because you don't have an opinion that the majority seems to have. So that is all I have for my October wrap up. I will see you guys in my next one. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.